If we turn once more to the ancient Oriental outlook, we must say, from what we have been able to indicate of this, that the human being knew then that he descended from spiritual heights, that he lived, before he entered into physical existence through conception and birth, in a spiritual world. He knew that he brought with him from the spiritual world something that was still in him, something that came out in childhood as disposition, as aspiration, and remained with him through the whole of his life on earth. In ancient times, every Oriental knew that what worked its way out of his soul during childhood, in youth, was a dowry from the spiritual worlds which he had experienced before entering into physical existence. To be aware theoretically that one has passed through a spiritual life of this kind before one's life on earth has no very great value, but a lively feeling for it is worth a great deal. It is something of the greatest value to feel that what has been growing and developing in one's soul since childhood comes from the spiritual world. Today, however, this feeling has given way to another. It has given way, both in the individual and more especially in the social life, to another feeling entirely. And there is something important here which must be looked at. More and more, there weighs down upon the human being, half unconsciously, the feeling of his inherited characteristics. Anyone who is able to view this impartially sees how the human being today actually feels that he is what he is through his parents, his grandparents, and so on. Unlike the human being in ancient times, he no longer feels that what flames up in him from childhood onwards comes from those depths in which is rooted that which he received from his spiritual experiences before his life on earth. On the contrary, he feels in himself the characteristics inherited from parents, grandparents, and so on. The first thing people ask about a child nowadays is from who it has got this or that characteristic, and the reply, however, is seldom that the child has it as a result of this or that particular experience in the spiritual world. People look instead to see whether it comes from the grandmother or grandfather, and so on. The more this emerges in individual people, not merely as a theory, but as a feeling of dependence on purely earthly inherited characteristics, the more oppressive and dreadful will it gradually become. And this feeling will increase in strength very rapidly. In the decades ahead, it will intensify to the point of becoming unbearable, for it is connected with another feeling, a certain feeling of the worthlessness of human existence. This will arise more and more, that the human being will feel his existence to be worthless if he cannot feel it to be anything other than the sum total of what has been implanted in his blood and his other organs by physically inherited characteristics. Today, what is emerging here is still, to a certain extent, mere theory, although there are poets who have already expressed it as experience. But it will emerge as a feeling, as a sense, and it will then become an oppressive characteristic in the feeling life of civilized humanity. This experiencing of oneself in the purely inherited characteristics will lie like a weight on the soul. It is here that the inability of natural science to give man an understanding of himself shows itself in all its poverty. The human being no longer feels himself to be a child of the spiritual world, but merely a child of characteristics inherited in the course of earthly, physical existence. All this is very forcibly manifest in social life. You've only to think of the demands that have arisen as the outcome of a gigantic piece of political stupidity which has spread through the world in recent years. This folly slowly gathered strength during recent centuries and then came to a climax in our own day. The great crisis of the second decade of the 20th century was ushered in when those who were supposed to be leading the several nations, who at any rate held positions which imply leadership and yet understood nothing of the situation mankind is in, when these people began talking about organizing mankind according to the will of its individual nations. It was indeed in our recent times that national chauvinism was aroused in its very worst sense. And it is national chauvinism that is ringing through the whole civilized world today. This is merely the social counterpart of the utterly reactionary worldview that tries to trace everything back to inherited characteristics. When one no longer strives to fathom one's nature as a human being and to fashion the social structure in such a way that this human nature can be at home in it, and when one strives instead to bring it about that the social structure corresponds only with what men are as Czechs, Slovaks, Magyars, Frenchmen, Englishmen, Poles, and so on, then one forgets all spirituality. Then all spirituality is excluded, and people try to order the world solely in accordance with characteristics inherited through the blood, because they have come more and more to the point of having no content at all in their concepts. This had to happen because this 20th century had to give us a taste of the fact that there can be a man marveled at by vast numbers as a world leader, even though there are no concepts in his words whatsoever. That there can be a man like Woodrow Wilson who utters words which no longer contain any concepts. It is for this reason that people have had to fall back upon something entirely devoid of spirit, on blood relationship, on the blood-related characteristics of the nations. All that has resulted from this is that peace treaties have been made in which people who know absolutely nothing about the conditions of life in the modern civilized world have determined the shape of the maps of the countries of that world. Nothing, perhaps, shows more clearly the materialism of modern times, its denial of everything spiritual, than the emergence of the principle of nationalism. Before ending this video, I'll quickly address a potential biblical argument against Steiner's claims here. Christians may point to Yahweh's choosing of Israel as his people in the Old Testament, and the way he sets the nation apart from other nations, instructing them not to mix with, and in some cases instructing them to kill, foreign peoples. This could indicate that nationalism is indeed important nowadays, and would also justify the present Israel's actions under the influence of this belief. However, this would stem from a common misunderstanding that happens nowadays, where the New Testament, which includes the present day, is interpreted through the lens of the Old Testament, rather than the reverse. Yahweh had to set the nation of Israel apart because he worked principally in their hereditary stream, through their blood, to bring about the maturing of the divine spark within them, which you could also call their I consciousness or ego consciousness. This culminated in the preparation of a vessel that was able to receive the Christ being. Jesus, of the bloodline of David, was born, whose sacrifice would allow everyone in the world to develop this divine spark through uniting with Christ in spirit, irregardless of one's blood composition. As of Jesus Christ's sacrifice, bloodline or nationality has ceased to matter, at least for the humanity that's progressing in a forward direction. It's by no means a waste of time to understand our physical roots and the role our country has played in the past or may play in the future. In fact, it can be very useful if we take into account the higher forces at play behind these things, such as the folk souls of nations. Nevertheless, many people nowadays are fixated on bloodline, genetics, and nationality in a materialistic sense, forsaking the impulse to understand our individual spiritual roots, our connection to Christ, and our destined future, in which we are completely detached from physical heredity. This is without a doubt backwards and harmful to humanity. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3, verse 28.